With the class, so for today's lesson, we will discuss community-based disaster risk reduction and management for preparedness. So at the end of this module, we can discuss different community-based practices for managing disaster risk to specific hazards, develop a community preparedness plan, prepare survival kits and materials for one's family, and for public information and advocacy. Concept of disaster risk reduction and management. Disaster risk management is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new disaster risk, reducing existing disaster risks, and manage residual risk, contributing to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of disaster losses. Disaster risk management actions can be distinguished between prospective disaster risk management, corrective disaster risk management, and compensatory disaster risk management, also called residual risk management. So we have the first one, prospective disaster risk management. These are activities addressed and seek to avoid the development of new or increased disaster risk. They focus on addressing a disaster risk that may develop in the future if disaster risk reduction policies are not put in place. For example, are better land use planning or disaster-resistant water supply system. So, in our figure, it refers to a nature-based, innovative, and low-cost solution for disaster-resilient drinking water supply in coastal Bangladesh called Management Aquifer Recharge or MAR. This is an example of disaster-resistant water supply system. It is the best way in prospective disaster risk management. So we'll explain what is an MAR. So in capturing process, the application of MAR can be simple, cost-effective, and maintained at the community level, where fresh water is collected from ponds and rooftops. Next, in storage process. After passing this water through a simple sand filter, it is infiltrated into a shallow saline aquifer through a ring of infiltrations. So aquifer is a portion of a groundwater that holds large amount of water. So this creates a floating lens of improved quality water underground. The freshwater lens stays intact underground, as you can see in our figure, because the water mixes only minimally with inherent brackish or saline water. Next, in usage, this fresh water can be abstracted using a standard hand pump to yield water throughout the year. Storage of fresh water in the ground also offers significant flood protection during the regular or cyclonic surge, when other traditional water sources are damaged by floods, and it is relatively safe from contamination, and therefore it can bring a continuity to water supplies during periods of drought. Next, we have corrective disaster risk management activities that address and seek to remove or reduce disaster risks which are already present and which need to be managed and reduced now. Examples are retrofitting of critical infrastructures or relocation of exposed population or assets. Okay, so I will show to you an example of corrective disaster risk management using retrofitting. Techniques for retrofitting of building. For upgrading of certain building systems, existing structures to make them more resistant against seismic activity and other hazards. The following techniques or methods are adopted for retrofitting. So we have adding steel bracing, jacketing method, and epoxy injection method. Adding steel bracing. Steel bracing is an effective solution in the retrofitting of building when large openings are required. It is done by putting a diagonal support frames at the center of a beam, as you can see in our image. Potential advantage due to higher strength and stiffness and opening for natural light can be provided also, and the amount of work is also less, so foundation costs may be minimized and adds much less weight to the existing structure. Next, we have jacketing technique. It is most used method of retrofitting of a building. Jacketing is the most popular used method for strengthening of columns and beams of a building. Jacketing consists of added concrete with longitudinal and transverse reinforcement around the existing columns, as you can see in our image. It improves the axial and shear strength of the columns to withstand earthquakes and strengthening the building. The amount of work is less, as a foundation strengthening does not require and increases the shear strength of the column. It also increases the confinement of concrete in circular columns. And steel jacketing does not increase the significant weight of the column and also saves construction time. Next, we have epoxy injection method. Epoxy injection is an economical method of repairing of non-moving cracks in the concrete walls, slabs, columns, and piers. And retrofitting of building, epoxy injection is used to fill and repair the structural fault caused by flash flood and earthquakes. It is capable of restoring the strength of concrete to its pre-crack strength. The epoxy tensile band to concrete is stronger than the tensile strength of concrete. Strengthening is provided by installing additional reinforcement across the failure plane, as you can see in our image, in a combination with the epoxy resin injection. The benefits of retrofitting of building. The following are benefits of retrofitting of building technique. It improves the stability and safety levels of the structure. Retrofitting buildings are more adaptable and suitable for existing activities or future activities and making a building more comfortable to resist loading. It helps also to prevent damage to the structure and injury to the occupants. Next, the process helps to improve a resident's ability to keep residents safe when there is an earthquake. Retrofitting also helps to make homes more habitable after any major earthquake. Also, when you get retrofitting done in your home, most insurance companies have increased their insurance benefits. And lastly, increasing the local capacity of the structural and non-structural components. Next, compensatory disaster risk management. These are pertaining to activities strengthened to social and economic resilience of individuals and societies in the face of residual risk that cannot be effectively reduced. They include preparedness, response, and recovery activities, but also a mix of different financing instruments, such as national contingency funds, contingent credit, insurance and reinsurance, and social safety nets. So in reality, it is very true that activities strengthen the social and economic resilience of individuals and societies in the face of residual risks that cannot be effectively reduced. Because in times of disaster, problems may include job loss, financial problems, illness, medical emergency, crop losses. Instead of falling into despair or hiding from problems with unhealthy coping strategies, resilient people face life's difficulties heads-on. Contingency funds could help this matter because they include the purchase of supplies for the new agricultural season in the event of crop losses, for example, to cover household expenses during emergencies and for productive and commercial activities for the community when income sources have been lost. Next, we have community-based disaster risk management. This promotes the involvement of potentially affected communities in disaster risk management at the local level. This includes community assessments of hazards, vulnerabilities, capacities, and their involvement in planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of local action for disaster risk reduction. So, this explains that a community based disaster management is an approach to building the capacity of communities to assess their vulnerability to both human induced and natural hazards and develop strategies and resources necessary to prevent or to mitigate the impact of identified hazards as well as respond, rehabilitate, and reconstruct local level, most especially those areas with high risk and vulnerability. Next, we have local and indigenous peoples' approach to disaster risk management. It is the recognition and useful of traditional indigenous and local knowledge and practices to complement scientific knowledge in disaster risk assessments and for planning and implementation of local disaster risk management. So, in the Philippines, we help indigenous peoples like ITAS better assert and protect their rights. We ensure they are included in the process and decision that affect their ancestral lands and vulnerability to conflict. Therefore, indigenous peoples have also the right to participate in decision making in matters that affect them. They should therefore be actively engaged in disaster risk reduction, prevention, and preparedness initiatives, particularly if these measures are likely to take place on or somehow affect their lands, territories, and resources. Indigenous peoples also have a great deal to contribute to disaster risk reduction, preparedness, and prevention, and states should take the opportunity to learn about time-tested indigenous practices that have arisen from a close relationship with the environment and include these lessons in their planning. Disaster risk management. Plans set out the goals and specific objectives for reducing disaster risk together with a related action to accomplish these objectives. They should be guided by the Sendai Framework Disaster Risk Reduction of 2015 to 2030 and considered and coordinated within relevant development plans, resources, allocation, and program activities. National level plans need to be specific to each level of administrative responsibility and adapted to the different social and geographical circumstances that are present. The time frame and responsibilities for implementation and the sources of funding should be specified in the plan. Linkages to sustainable development and climate change adaptation plans should be made where possible. So, in addition to this, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is an international document that was adopted by United Nations member states between 14 to 18 March of 2015 at the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction held in Sendai, Japan, and endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly in June 2015. Purpose of Sendai Framework aims to achieve a substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods, and health and in the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets of persons, business, communities, and countries over the next 15 years. The United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. The United Nations or UN General Assembly created the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction in 1999 as part of the UN Secretariat. UNISDR aims to guide and coordinate the efforts of a wide range of partners to achieve a substantive reduction in disaster losses and build resilient nations and communities as an essential condition for sustainable development. Among its objectives are the following: climate change adaptation, increasing investment for DRRM, building disaster-resilient cities, schools and hospitals, and strengthening the international systems for DRRM. Importance of DRRM. Asia and the Pacific are identified to have the most number and high frequency of disaster impact. According to Asian Development Bank of 2014, more than half of the world's deaths and losses occurred in the Asia-Pacific region between 1970 and 2012, and this accounted for 43% of the total global socio-economic losses. Disaster loss does not only affect those directly receiving its impact, because almost all countries and communities interact globally. Everyone is affected by one's disaster's loss. Hence, there is a need for an effort to reduce disaster risk by integrating policies, plans, and programs for sustainable development, supported through bilateral, regional, and international collaboration and partnerships. So in addition to this, according to National Geographic, Asia-Pacific nations experience more natural disasters than any other region. Between 2014 and 2017, nations in this region were affected by 55 earthquakes, 217 storms and cyclones, and 236 cases of severe flooding, impacting 650 million people and causing the deaths of 33,000 people. In addition, DRRM helps us identify and map local capacities to cope with these hazards. Ultimately, the DRR approach helps us conduct effective disaster response while reducing risks that similar disasters will occur. Also, ensure that our emergency response does no harm by replacing or reinstating critical vulnerabilities. Should be given utmost priority, especially in the Philippines, because of the following reasons. The first one, the Philippines, by virtue of its geographical location, is exposed to numerous geological and hydrometeorological hazards. To lower the risk of disaster brought by this natural hazard, it is important that DRRM be in place. Next, the Philippines, is being a developing country, may not have enough materials and support to address the immediate needs of disaster victims and to recover from the damage of disasters. To be prepared for the potential damage of disasters, a DRRM needs to be implemented. Next, DRRM is essential in building a more equitable and sustainable future for the communities in high risk for disaster. The key principles of DRRM justify why certain changes have to be made. If any, it explains the urgency of creating DRRM plan. Key principles should be made to make people realize why disaster plans should find its position at the top of the priority list of any community that is vulnerable to any forms of hazards. Hence, all DRRMs are created on the following premises. So this explains that the first priority when responding to a disaster is to immediately plan for, coordinate, and carry out effective preparation. Disaster response includes community assessment, surveillance, health education, and coordination of shelter arrangements. Key principles of DRRM. The first one, development can either increase or decrease disaster risk. DRRM policies, laws, and regulation will not save lives unless implemented in communities. The community is the front line of disaster risk management. DRRM is not a standalone activity. The main objective of DRRM is to build a resilient community. So, the disaster plan aims to reduce the damage caused by natural hazards like earthquake, floods, droughts, and cyclones through an ethic of prevention. Disasters often follow natural hazards. Each decision and action makes us more vulnerable to disasters or more resilient to disasters, so it is better to do the appropriate plan for a specific disaster. Elements of DRRM plans. A DRRM plans covers all stages of development from planning all the way to execution. It also incorporates feedback, recommendation, and guidance taken from various sectors of the society. It is a cyclic process of updating information and plans to make the DRRM more specific and sustainable to the community. The following are the basic elements of DRRM plan in order to execution. The first one, we have assessment and analysis. This is known as the needs and risk assessment. Risks are identified and assessed based on the following. Hazard profile. A hazard profile is a description and analysis of a specific type of local hazard. It is performed for each natural hazard and based on the criteria such as frequency, duration, and speed of the event of hazards. Next, we have the vulnerability of the area. In general, vulnerability means the potential to be harmed. Vulnerability to natural hazard is thus the potential to be harmed by natural hazard in a particular area. Some people and places are more vulnerable to certain hazards than other people and places. Next, we have the capacity of the community. Capacity of the community refers to all strength, attributes, and resources available within a community, organizations, or society to manage and reduce disaster risks. So all these criteria must be included as primary assessment and analysis for the best outcome of a disaster plan. Next, we have the design. This is modeled on findings from the assessment and analysis stage. It should include, at the minimum, the following components: issues identified during analysis, identification of responsibility, priorities, and competencies of individuals and institutions or agencies carrying out the task, identification of other programs and strategies that may complement, add, or duplicate with other programs, potential partners, allies and networks, and source of funding and its restriction. So, for a design to be implemented appropriately, the disaster management strategy focuses on preventing destruction from natural disasters through an appropriate or correct advocacy, prevention, knowledge management, better coordination, capacity building strategies, and a better preparedness through advanced emergency response. Next, we have the results and implementation. Implementing the DRRM is usually in the form of a drill. Regular implementation is important because new conditions or unforeseen situations always arise in communities because of their dynamism. The outcome of the implementation should be properly and accurately documented so that any necessary changes in the DRRM design can be made immediately. Also, in this component, constant confirmation of partnership and network is necessary to enhance the relationship of all sectors involved and the efficiency of all their identified rules and services. This becomes crucial during emergency situation, as priorities usually done based on the established relationship of beneficiary of assistance. Community-based DRRM. A community-based DRRM is essential to develop, implement, and maintain an effective early warning system in a hazard-prone community. Through a community preparedness plan, the community is informed and trained on how to prepare for hazard, events, and emergencies. For an effective community preparedness plan, communities need to be actively involved in it. The components of a community preparedness plan are the following. Community-based DRRM. Community profile. It is under identification of vulnerable communities. This accounts for all communities within the area and their levels of exposure to an identified hazard. Next, we have the manpower. Expert conducting risk assessment. At the minimum, the DRRM experts may be sourced locally or externally. Consider the basic elements of DRRM as framework for the community-based DRRM plan. Initially, the experts oversee, implement, update, and manage the whole plan. Eventually, the locals of the community will be trained so that they will take over the implementation of the DRRM plan. So in addition to this, many individuals responsible for local disaster management have limited training in the field and need increased access to training programs and materials. Interdisciplinary, multi-jurisdictional training is especially valuable because it encourages mutual understanding and lays the foundation for cooperation in times of emergency and preparedness. Ultimately, the DRRM manpower helps conduct effective disaster response while reducing risk that similar disasters will reoccur. It also ensures that our emergency response does no harm by replacing or reinstating critical vulnerabilities. Next, we have the rescue team. Rescue team. Trained personnel or experts are designated to form a team for the following. So we have the first one, search and rescue. Next, medical assistance and relief distribution. So the main objective of search and rescue team is to rescue trapped survivors of a disaster. Then first aid should be provided to the injured people. In the event of deaths during the disaster, the team should ensure the immediate disposal of the bodies as this may cause health hazards for the others. Emergency medical services are vital during all phases of disaster response, with key rules including mass casualty or triage, on-scene treatment, communication evacuation, coordination of patient transport, and patient tracking. So in addition, social welfare, food, water, medication, clothes, etc. given to people in need, especially in disaster areas. Those are pertaining to relief distribution. The relational connectivity with local authorities, NGOs, etc. This identifies the community's relationship with certain agencies and institutions in terms of providing aid, facilitating services, and supporting programs related to the implementation, improvement, and enhancement of the DRRM plan. So in addition to this, the national government or the NGOs enable citizens to work together voluntarily to promote social values and civic goals, which are important to them. They promote local initiative and problem solving, most especially in times of disaster. Next, we have the physical infrastructure. This is in the identification of both a vertical building, poles and trees, and horizontal roads, cable, wires, pipes, and bridges, infrastructures and natural elements that may be affected or can cause disasters from hazard. Different hazards have different effects on these structures that may cause disaster to its users. Okay, so for example, in our image, we have the image of clearing arrangement before and after a calamity, for example, a typhoon. So every barangay, by the help of disaster risk reduction management, in cooperation with the volunteers, must be conducted its clearing operation by cutting trees and fixing electrical cables and pause in preparation for typhoon, which is expected to bring heavy rains in the whole community. Next, we have the risk assessment. Section includes the identification of each potential hazard and the level of disaster risk that the community has on each hazard. The guiding parameters in assessing the risk include the following. First one, we have the vulnerability of the community to hazard. So the level of vulnerability is highly dependent upon the economic status of individuals, communities, and nations. The poor are usually more vulnerable to disasters because they lack the resources to build sturdy structures and put other important measures in place to protect themselves from being negatively impacted by disaster. Next, we have the potential magnitude of the hazard, high scale or low scale. The frequency of a natural hazard event is the number of times it occurs within a specified time interval in a given particular area. The magnitude of a natural hazard event is related to the energy released by the event. It is distinguished from intensity, which is related to the effects at a specific location or area. And in that case, we can now measure high or lows on the scale of potential magnitude to hazards. Next, we have the duration of impact, short-term or long-term, of the hazard to the community. Whether it is direct or indirect disasters or losses refer to directly or indirectly quantifiable losses such as number of people killed and the damage to infrastructures like buildings and some establishment, and also the natural resources. Indirect disaster losses include declines in output or revenue and impact on well-being of people and generally arise from disruption to the flow of goods and services as a result of a disaster. Next, we have the causality of effects, directly exposed elements, and reversibility of potential disasters to the community and other identified stakeholders. So, direct and indirect losses refer to indirectly quantifiable losses of the reversibility of potential disaster to community and other identified stakeholders. Early warning system. An early warning system, or EWS, is the provision or information about an imminent hazard that is likely to affect community. This may be in various forms of communication. Example, sound symbol letter. It can be easily and immediately understood by all stakeholders. The EWS should be short, distinct, and clear so as not to be confused with ordinary communication. It does not require urgent action. Most warning systems involve alert levels that are distinguished through colors. For example, red usually connotes imminent danger. So in addition to this, early warning system is a major element of disaster risk reduction. To be effective, early warning system need to be actively involve the communities at risk, facilitate public education and awareness of risk, effectively disseminate messages and warnings, and ensure there is constant state of preparedness. Next, we have the emergency response protocol. Search and rescue. The objective here to search for and provide immediate aid to survivors of a disaster. One important aspect in a successful search and rescue operation is the familiarity of rescuer with various locations in the community. In case where missing or lost persons are in areas that are not readily visible or accessible, a familiar rescuer may be able to find them because of his or her knowledge of the site prior to the disaster. The rescuer should also be cognizant or should be aware of potential risks such as limited entry or exits, possible secondary or multiple collapse of unstable structures, electrical and gas hazards, and waterborne diseases. To ensure their safety, the rescuer should observe the following. The first one, wear protective gear at all times. So this explains that the rescuer should wear a personal protective equipment, or PPE for short. It refers to the equipment worn by rescuers and healthcare providers to protect themselves from injury or infection during an emergency. Next, constantly monitor for vital signs. In terms of emergency rescue operation, if there are signs of exhaustion, the search and rescue operation is scheduled should be adjusted or the personnel be rotated, as possible additional people should be brought in. When we monitor a patient, we are typically looking to observe and, if possible, record their level of responses for constantly checking vital signs like breathing, pulse, and maybe their temperature. This will not only make us aware of any changes in the patient's condition, but will give the paramedics valuable information when they arrive. Next, decontamination of rescuers and their equipment should be done before leaving the rescue site to prevent the spread of health hazards or secondary contamination. So, for example, ordinarily firefighters, as you can see in our image, wears a turnout gear and other types of protective apparel that is relatively rugged for variable response environments. This gear is often intended to last for years when properly cleaned and maintained. So, during the COVID-19 pandemic, some firefighters are using single-use or disposable items because it is generally considered safer to simply remove and throw away the items that decontaminate them for reuse. Unfortunately, most organizations are attempting to conserve their disposable PPE given the uncertainty over supply levels. Further, for many firefighters can immediately know a patient's COVID-19 status, so they have to assume that any individual could be infectious. Most reusable gear is intended to be clean, and for many products, there are well-established procedures for their contamination. For example, clear distinctions are made for how different elements of the structural firefighting protective ensemble can be either sanitized or disinfected for neutralizing microbial contamination. So in contrast, much disposable clothing has never been intended to be reused because it doesn't have the physical integrity for repeated use. In those cases where organizations are attempting to decontaminate and reuse disposable respirators and clothing, this practice is only as a last resort when no other PPE of the needed type is available. Next, needs of survivors. So in the midst of losing properties and loved ones, survivors need to address their basic needs: water, food, shelter, and health care. A well-planned DRRM provides survivors with these needs: clean, potable water, ready-to-eat food, huge, secured, and safe evacuation centers, visible, accessible, and equipped health care providers, and debriefing. So disaster emergency response should address the immediate and priority needs resulting from a disaster. A disaster assessment will need to determine existence of these needs as well as their scope to provide basic life support needs. It's like drinking water and sanitation, adequate food, appropriate medical assistance, shelter through housing and clothing, and fuel for cooking and heating. Next, we have survival kit and materials. Please refer to Table 1.0 for the complete contents of survival kit. All families need to prepare at home a survival kit that becomes handy during disaster. This kit should contain essential items, should be waterproof, and should be checked regularly for any expiring medicines or materials. So in our Table 1.0 is an example of emergency checklist. So we can say that having an emergency kit checklist is an important step to prepare and protect your household for unforeseen events, just like flash floods, earthquakes, or even tsunami. An emergency kit is essential for short-term survival, providing vital items for you, your family, or household. It is a good idea to always keep your kit in a handy place known to everyone in the household. So what should be included in an emergency kit, and what do you need in a survival kit? So in my own opinion, for example, we need a water 1 gallon per person per day, 3 days supply for evacuation, 2 weeks supply for home. Next, we also need food, non-perishable, easy to prepare items, just like canned goods, 3 days supply for evacuation, 2 weeks supply for home. Next, we also need a flashlight and lighter. And we also need battery-powered radio or weather radio if possible. In addition to our checklist, we must also add important documents in a survival kit, because documents are one often overlooked area of preparedness. Is having copies of important documents which would prove your identity and position to the authorities. Next, we have the general evacuation procedures. The following are general guidelines that need to be remembered and followed in an evacuation. The first one, be aware of emergency exits and warning calls of buildings you frequently go to. Next, when emergency alarms are sounded, keep calm and try to keep others calm too. Next, exits the building using the stairwells, never use the elevator. Next, if there is a DRRM personnel redirecting people on what to do, follow his or her instructions to facilitate a systematic and orderly evacuation or DRRM procedure. Next, once in the assembly area, notify authorities of people who need assistance, such as injured, trapped, or disabled. Next, never re-enter the building unless it has been declared safe by authorities. Recovery plans. This is the process of gradually restoring the community to return to its pre-disaster level of functioning. Remember that one of the principles of DRRM is to build a resilient community. Having a recovery plans will give communities option for rehabilitation, of livelihood, restoration, of social and economic activities, advancement in development projects, and reconstruction of shelters and infrastructures. Resilient communities have a proactive attitude toward disaster. They view it as a learning process instead of destructive event. Simple because they are equipped with recovery plans. Next, we have the Community Disaster Reduction Plan. This is important to develop a comprehensive DRRM plan to estimate and allocate funds for the implementation of the plan before and during and after a disaster. Aside from various components identified in each stage, a contingency fund is always provided for expenses that are overlooked or an allowance for inflation. All estimates of computation should be conservative to allow for any changes in fees and costs. Responsible management and utilization of funds need to be strictly exercised in this regard. Okay, so in addition to this, a disaster recovery plan and community disaster reduction fund describes scenarios for resuming work quickly and reducing interruption in the aftermath of a disaster. Disasters prompts our desire to help in some way. When we see images of people suffering, we want to do something. The best part is responding in a way that is actually helpful and appropriate. It's essential to wait for the people who have been directly affected by disaster to take the lead in indicating what they need and when they need it. Understanding the phases of disaster can be very helpful in determining how we can help.